Hey Secoids, in this flip video we're going to talk about Reconstructing America and how do we try to solve the problems left after the Civil War. Some of the problems the country was faced with were how do we deal with Confederate leaders? How do we reunite the Confederate states back into the Union? How do we rebuild that war-torn South? How can we secure the rights of African Americans? And how can African Americans rebuild their own lives? And Confederate leaders and the Southern states. So after the death of Abraham Lincoln, we had two kind of plans trying to be put into place when it came to Reconstruction. For Lincoln, he pardoned the Confederates who swore allegiance to the United States. Once 10% took loyalty oath, the state could apply to become a state again. President Lincoln provided generous amnesty to allow Southerners to retain their property and reacquire their political rights. Now, President Johnson was mostly the same as Lincoln, but he was a bit harsh on Confederate leaders and excluded them from having voting rights going forward. President Johnson also agreed that we should end slavery, but he felt states should decide the voting issue on whether African Americans should have the right to vote or not. Failures of Lincoln's and Johnson's plans included many states came up with these black codes, or many states passed laws restricting the rights of freed men, literacy tests, separation of races, and little help was done to provide these freed men with economic hardships. And eventually these states would be readmitted governments that refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenships to all males. When it comes to congressional reconstruction, it is much harder on the South. They felt they should be punished. All right, for the Reconstruction Act of 1867, it did not recognize Southern state governments, and they were divided into 5 military districts that were overseen by Union generals, and it required states to grant African Americans the right to vote. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 also required states to grant African Americans the right to vote. One supporter of African American freedmen was the Freedmen's Bureau, and this provided food, clothing, and shelter and education to the freed men. And we had what was passed known as the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and declared all people in the United States citizens except Native Americans and defined and protected citizens' rights, trying to undercut these black codes being created. And this would end up requiring Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment. This map here showcases the 5 military districts when it came to military reconstruction. And when it comes to securing the rights of African Americans, you have the 13th Amendment of 1865. It ended slavery in all parts of the United States. No more compromises were in existence. For the 14th Amendment in 1868, it cannot deny the rights and privileges to any U.S. citizen, all persons born or naturalized in the United States. So the question being here, what decision does this law overturn? This amendment ends up overturning the Dred Scott decision that was passed. And for the 15th Amendment in 1870, no one can be kept from voting because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Who is not included? Women. And when it comes to rebuilding the war-torn South, in 1870, all states were back into the Union and under the Congress Reconstruction Act. And the Republican governments in the South created public work programs to help rebuild physical damage, and public education system continued to develop. And of course, we would have resistance to African American equality. It was the development of the white supremacy groups like the KKK. They destroyed the Republican Party and prevented African Americans from achieving their equality. They killed around 20,000 men, women, and children, often by lynching, and not just African Americans, but white sympathizers as well. African Americans tried to rebuild their lives. They built churches, received help from the North to become centers for communities, and they worked to build schools for African Americans. They voted and held offices in Southern governments. And what started was sharecropping to help feed and clothe families. And they rented land from plantation owners and paid them with crops. This endless cycle resulted in a circle of debt, and that never grew enough crops to make profit, so African Americans kept them poor. This image here showcases a great example of how the sharecropper cycle of poverty worked. And questions to consider going forward, did the solutions that were created during this Reconstruction period solve the problems left from the Civil War? Some did, but at the same time, there were still a lot of challenges that would continue to go on for the next 100 years. Thanks for tuning in to today's Flip video. If you have any questions, just ask in class or just do a quick rewind. Have a great day. Take care.